there is a photograph I keep coming back to. It was taken in 1993, inside the enclosure surrounding the Great Sphinx at Giza, not of the Sphinx itself, of the wall behind it, the limestone bedrock that was carved away, over centuries or millennia, to reveal the statue we know. In the photograph, you can see the erosion pattern on that wall clearly, deep vertical channels running from top to bottom, rounded undulating grooves worn into the rock, the kind of surface you associate not with wind, not with sand, but with water. Moving water, water running down a surface repeatedly over a long period of time. I am not a geologist. I want to say that at the start, because it matters. I cannot look at that photograph and tell you with certainty what caused those channels, but I can tell you that a man who spent 30 years studying rock weathering patterns looked at the same photograph and came to a very specific conclusion, and that conclusion has never been geologically refuted. Not once, not in 30 years. His name was Robert Schoch, and what he proposed was not a conspiracy theory. It was a stratigraphic argument, one that happens to be profoundly inconvenient for almost everything we know about ancient Egypt. To understand why Schoch's argument matters, you need to understand what the Sphinx enclosure actually is. The Sphinx is not a freestanding statue. It was carved directly out of the plateau at Giza, cut downward into the bedrock from above. The act of carving it left behind a surrounding depression, the enclosure, with walls of exposed limestone rising on 3 sides. Those walls are part of the original Giza plateau. They have been there, exposed to the elements, since the moment the statue was carved. If you want to know when the Sphinx was built, one way to approach that question is to look at those walls. Read the weathering. Ask what kind of erosion is present and what conditions would have produced it. This is not a radical methodology. It is what geologists do. The conventional answer, held by the vast majority of Egyptologists, is that the Sphinx was built around 2500 BC, during the reign of the pharaoh Khafra. There is circumstantial evidence for this. A causeway connects the Sphinx temple to Khafra's pyramid complex. An ancient stela found between the Sphinx's paws seems to associate the monument with Khafra, and the face of the Sphinx, by some interpretations, bears a resemblance to surviving portraits of Khafra himself, though Egyptologists disagree on this, and the face has been significantly recarved over the centuries. The consensus is not arbitrary. It is built on real evidence. I want to be clear about that. But it is also built largely on archaeological evidence, on what was found nearby, what inscriptions say, what the architectural context implies. What it is not built on, or not primarily built on, is an analysis of the weathering on the enclosure walls themselves. That is what Schoch brought to the question. Robert Schoch first visited Giza in 1990, brought there by John Anthony West, an amateur Egyptologist who had spent years arguing that the erosion on the Sphinx enclosure looked more like water erosion than wind erosion. West was not a scientist, and the academic establishment had essentially ignored him, but he wanted a geologist's opinion. Schoch was a Boston University professor. With a solid background in stratigraphy and sedimentary geology, he agreed to take a look. What he saw surprised him. The erosion on the enclosure walls, in his assessment, was characteristic of precipitation-induced weathering, water running down vertical surfaces over an extended period. This is a distinctive pattern. Wind erosion in desert environments tends to produce horizontal layering, undercutting softer rock strata and leaving harder strata as ridges. Water erosion on vertical surfaces produces something different. Deep vertical channels, rounded profiles, the kind of rounding you only get when water moves repeatedly over stone. Schoch published his findings in 1991 in the Proceedings of the Geological Society of America. His conclusion was that the erosion pattern was inconsistent with construction around 2500 BC, a period when Egypt was already arid. The Sahara had been drying out for thousands of years by that point. There simply had not been enough rainfall in the region since roughly 5000 BC to produce the weathering he was observing. His estimate, based on the depth and character of the erosion, was that the enclosure walls had been exposed to rainfall, weathering for a much longer period. His proposed construction window was somewhere between 7000 and 5000 BC at the earliest. Possibly older. He was careful to say he couldn't be certain. The honest answer, he wrote, was that the geology was consistent with a much earlier date than the archaeological consensus allowed for. That is a significant claim. I am not saying it's correct, but it is a geological claim, made by a geologist, published in a peer-reviewed venue, based on direct field observation. The response from the Egyptological community was not primarily geological. This is the part of the story I find most interesting. Not because it proves Schoch right, but because of what it reveals about how academic disciplines interact when they come into conflict. Egyptologists pushed back hard, and they did so largely on archaeological grounds. The argument was essentially this: there is no evidence of a civilization capable of carving the Sphinx existing in Egypt or the surrounding region before 3000 BC. The proto-dynastic and pre-dynastic periods are well documented. We have settlements, pottery, tools, burial practices. What we don't have is any sign of a society with the organizational capacity to carve a monument that size. Possibly older. He was careful to say he couldn't be certain. The honest answer, he wrote, was that the geology was consistent with a much earlier date than the archaeological consensus allowed for. That is a significant claim. I am not saying it's correct, but it is a geological claim, made by a geologist, published in a peer-reviewed venue, based on direct field observation. The response from the Egyptological community was not primarily geological. This is the part of the story I find most interesting. Not because it proves Schoch right, but because of what it reveals about how academic disciplines interact when they come into conflict. Egyptologists pushed back hard, and they did so largely on archaeological grounds. The argument was essentially this: there is no evidence of a civilization capable of carving the Sphinx existing in Egypt or the surrounding region before 3000 BC. The proto-dynastic and pre-dynastic periods are well documented. We have settlements, pottery, tools, burial practices. What we don't have is any sign of a society with the organizational capacity to carve a monument that size. This is a legitimate objection. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it is still an important consideration. If Schoch were right, there would presumably have to have been people capable of creating the Sphinx long before we have any evidence of organized monumental construction in the region. That is a very large gap to account for. One prominent Egyptologist, Mark Lehner, who has spent decades excavating at Giza, argued that the weathering Schoch identified could be explained by other factors: salt weathering, subsurface moisture, the particular properties of the limestone in that section of the plateau. He also noted that the Sphinx temple walls, built from blocks removed during the Sphinx's carving, show a similar weathering pattern, and those blocks were clearly assembled during the Old Kingdom period. This is a reasonable counter-argument. I don't have the expertise to resolve it, but it does raise a genuine geological question that Schoch subsequently addressed. If the Sphinx temple blocks show similar weathering to the enclosure walls, it might mean those blocks were exposed to earlier weathering before being used in construction. Or it might mean the weathering pattern has a different explanation than rainfall. The evidence is genuinely ambiguous. What bothered me about the response to Schoch was not that people disagreed with him. Disagreement is how science works. What bothered me was a word. At a 1992 session of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where Schoch presented his findings, the response from the archaeological side was largely dismissive. One Egyptologist used the word pyramidiacy. It appeared in subsequent coverage. That word is not a geological argument. It is a social signal. It says this question is not worth taking seriously, and the person asking it is not worth engaging with. Schoch was never formally refuted on the geology. The debate shifted instead to whether his interpretation was plausible, given the broader archaeological record, which is a different argument, and one that can't be resolved by looking at erosion patterns alone. I want to pause here and be honest about something. The fact that Schoch wasn't refuted on the geology does not mean he was right. Science doesn't work by default victories. A geologist reading limestone erosion is operating with genuine uncertainty. The variables involved: microclimate, underground moisture, salt crystallization, the specific composition of the Giza. Plateau limestone are complex, enough that confident conclusions in either direction are difficult. There is also a broader problem with the argument's structure. The absence of a geological refutation is not the same as geological confirmation. Schoch observed a pattern and offered an interpretation. That interpretation may be correct. It may also be wrong in ways that require a much more detailed analysis of the site than has been published in the peer-reviewed literature. The Giza Plateau has been studied extensively, but the Sphinx enclosure itself has not been the subject of the kind of systematic geological analysis that would settle these questions. We don't have a comprehensive, published study of the precise depth and distribution of the weathering patterns, how they vary across different sections of the wall, how they compare to datable weathering patterns elsewhere on the plateau. That study hasn't been done, or if it has, it hasn't been published. This is the kind of thing that makes me careful. The absence of a published refutation might mean the argument is strong, or it might mean that the geological details of the Sphinx enclosure are not a high enough priority for funded excavation programs to investigate carefully. Those are very different situations. Schoch continued working on the question for the next 3 decades. In later publications, he connected the Sphinx weathering to a broader hypothesis about the Younger Dryas, a period of catastrophic climate disruption that ended roughly around 9700 BC, associated with significant precipitation events, glacial melt, and massive flooding in various parts of the world. His argument evolved. Perhaps the deepest erosion on the Sphinx enclosure dates to that period, when the region would have experienced significantly more rainfall than it has in historical times. This would push the initial carving further back, possibly to before the Younger Dryas event. This is where the hypothesis becomes harder to evaluate, not because it's implausible as geology, but because it requires stacking multiple inferences. To get from observable erosion patterns to a pre-Younger Dryas construction date, you need to accept a particular reading of the weathering, a particular model of rainfall distribution in the region during that period, and a particular explanation for why no other archaeological trace of the builders survives. Each step is possible. The compounded uncertainty is significant. There were also seismic tests. In the early 1990s, teams using ground-penetrating radar and seismic analysis around the Sphinx reported anomalies beneath the enclosure floor, spaces that seemed inconsistent with solid bedrock. These findings were noted cautiously as suggesting possible cavities or chambers. The Egyptian authorities denied further excavation permits. I don't know why. Maybe it was bureaucratic. Maybe it was concern about destabilizing the monument. Maybe it was something else. I genuinely can't say. But the denial is a fact. And the anomalies detected by multiple independent teams are also a fact. What they mean, I can't tell you. The deeper question raised by Schoch's work is not really about the Sphinx. It's about how we handle anomalies in the historical record, how scientific disciplines, with different methodologies, interact when they reach different conclusions about the same object, and how the sociology of academic consensus shapes which questions get asked and which get quietly set aside. There is a version of this story in which Schoch is simply wrong, his geological interpretation is mistaken, and the absence of a formal published refutation reflects only the limited attention mainstream geology pays to Egyptological debates. That version is entirely possible. There is another version, in which he identified a real pattern that the broader field has not adequately engaged with, because the implications are too disruptive to the existing framework, and because disciplines tend to protect their own interpretive authority. I don't know which version is true, and I'm suspicious of anyone who claims to know with confidence. The evidence is incomplete, the methodologies in conflict, and the stakes of being wrong in either direction are high, enough that motivated reasoning pulls hard on everyone involved. What I keep coming back to is the narrower, more specific version of the question. Not, was the Sphinx built thousands of years earlier than we think? That's a claim I can't evaluate. But has the weathering on the enclosure walls been adequately explained by the existing consensus? That question I can hold more precisely, and the honest answer seems to be not fully, not yet. The channels are still there. The rounded grooves are still in the limestone. The debate about what produced them is still unresolved in the geological literature. And that by itself seems worth knowing.